Well, hey, welcome everybody to another episode of Grow Sessions presented by TSRgrow. My name is Mark Doherty. I'm your host. Again, nobody is more surprised than me that they keep asking me back to step in as the guest host for these podcasts. We've had some really awesome discussions the last 3 or 4 months, I guess, since we've been doing this. And today is no exception. I want to welcome Jeff Rawson from am I getting this right, Jeff? It's the International
The
Cannabis
Institute of
Science
Cannabis Science.
Institute of Cannabis Science. So
Yeah.
something that I'm just learning about in meeting Jeff, and really interesting stuff. He's based out of Massachusetts, out of Plymouth, Massachusetts, joining us today to tell us more about the work that he's doing and overall the work that he's progressing in the space. I know that, reading up on you a little bit, you're focused on safety, you're focused on testing, you're focused on helping to work on regulations and a lot of good stuff in our cannabis space. So tell me more about the work you're doing and how'd you come to this work? How did you come into this space and offer this service?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here with you. Yeah, I will be glad to introduce a little bit of the thinking behind the Institute of Cannabis Science. Yeah, we exist to make sure that consumers of cannabis are safe, and that they're getting what they pay for. That's consumer protection, I guess, in a nutshell. I think a lot of times in the United States, I mean, we're very lucky. Like we have a pretty well regulated consumer space overall in our country. Good food safety, high quality pharmaceuticals. Um, so I think that a lot of us, maybe we don't think so much about consumer protection in our country,
Mhm.
but we actually didn't always have such great systems, and it took dedicated efforts of really committed people over decades, centuries, to get us to this point. If you might recall from your history class, um, the names of people like Upton Sinclair and Ralph Nader, people who have brought about different sorts of revolutions in our expectations of worker and consumer safety. Um, so, uh, um, uh, yeah, so the Institute of Cannabis Science exists because there was a vacuum for that when it came to cannabis. And as we see cannabis becoming commercialized, um, it and it becomes a different sort of a thing, with
Mhm.
scale.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
there, of course, there was commercial scale in the old days too. That was kind of different, though, right? I mean, I think yeah, right. So it's a new kind of commercialization. It's new. There's all kinds of new form factors of products. Um, People need consumer protection for that. So that is really the fundamental mindset behind it.
Okay. So when I think about safety and consumer safety around cannabis products, my thoughts gravitate towards mold and microbial, gravitate towards, pesticides or, other, treatments that may be banned or regulated in different ways, and the levels of those that could be potentially present in final form product, whether it's flower, whether it's, vape, whether it's whatever form it's taking, an edible. Is that on the safety side of your mission? Are those the things that you're looking at, or is there more to that?
Well, those are absolutely some of the concerns that we have. We definitely want consumers to be assured that they are getting the product they believe they are. If they believe that it's organically grown, they should actually have some assurance of that. For example, right? If they see that it's in the regulated market space, and the batch has passed some kind of testing, they need assurance that that it actually is as clean as it was supposed to be. And I think that So I guess I'll kind of state sort of fundamental principle that I guess inspires me, which I'm a chemist by training. I have a PhD in chemistry, um, but uh, I have had the good fortune um, uh, for a period of my life um, working in a research space with mostly engineers. And I learned kind of some different perspectives from engineers that, we're a little absent in the chemistry space, I would say. And so, and one of those is that you only control what you measure.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and I realized that we were setting up these cannabis markets. We are making a whole bunch of rules about how to do everything. But in many cases, there's almost no checking at all of the outputs in the consumer space to see if it's actually working. Like when people do all these, just as an example, thinking perfectly innocently, all right? We're all, they're taking the batch of weed, they're submitting some buds from the batch, they get a value of like the THC in it, the total THC, let's say, THC A and Delta 9 THC, the intoxicating compound. Um, and right, and then they take that batch of flower and they pack it all up. In a few states, they actually have final form testing, but in Massachusetts, that's not mandated. So the batch could be totally unpackaged at the time of compliance testing, right? They pack it all up. They break those packs. They break those like jars or whatever into bundles to send to different stores. They send it to the stores. The stores keep it for a little while, put it on their shelf, move it around, shake it up maybe, right? Maybe drop it, maybe leave it in the sun for a few hours. Then they sell it, right? And we just expect that it's just going to work and the number on the jar is going to mean something without checking to see if it actually does,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
just thinking from an innocent perspective,
hmm
um, I realized that there was something missing.
Got it.
And and it's kind of fundamental, it's about safety, it's about quality, it's about whether any of this means anything. It's about how should people actually be shopping for their cannabis, right? What questions should they be asking, or what should they look at about it to choose the right one for them? Um,
Sure. Sure. So
so yeah,
you're
I would say, like, in a very hands-off way,
mhm,
that's the thought process.
okay.
The risks are all of those things that, the things that you mentioned and plenty more. And, the thing that's fun, like, as you start changing form factors, right, and doing new things like putting it into vape carts, or putting it into different kinds of foods and stuff like that, you introduce new variables
Sure.
and new, sometimes unanticipated hazards that you don't discover right away.
hmm
So that's just a normal part of, it's a normal accompaniment of innovation, I think,
Okay.
actually,
So
right?
you're not you're looking at safety, like we mentioned, but you're also looking at what does this label really mean when it says, in terms of a cannabinoid, a terpene expression of certain values, right? It's 30% of this and then 2% of that. Do these labels, do these testing that's done at some point in the supply chain, does that even, is that what it is, right? And so it's all the way around. When we look at a label that's on a jar, that's on a mylar bag, whatever it's on, does this mean something to the consumer? Can they rely on this information that's shown here? Just like when I pick up a can of soup, I can see that it's 100 calories per serving with 20 grams of carbohydrates or whatever, that this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
final form. So when you look at that, right? I mean, I guess there's a bunch of questions for me, right? Which is, first of all, one, are you doing testing of product off the shelf? That's kind of how I would think about it. So we
Yeah.
say, okay, we've got this jar. We go to dispensary X, we buy a jar of this brand of product, and we take it to a lab and we do testing on that to see, does what's in the jar actually align with what's on the label? Is that what you're doing?
That is part of what I do. That is definitely one of the things I do. So uh, one of my inspirations for the Institute of Cannabis Science is consumer reports. Uh, I think that some listeners will likely um, remember Consumer Reports as a magazine
Mhm.
that might have been around their parents' house. And it had reviews of products. All right. It still exists and they have a website. But what Consumer Reports, it's, to say that it's a magazine is actually pretty reductive. They publish a magazine, but it is a nonprofit organization founded to protect consumers. And it, and it, like Consumer Reports, the foundation hires scientists and investigative journalists, and they buy products from the consumer space. And their principle is that it has to be the product that they test has to be one that any other consumer could have just bought, right? It can't be cherry picked, it can't be donated, right? Um, so they test products and they see how they are, and they have tested all kinds of things. So a recent example, and I posted about this on on social media as well this past week, was Consumer Reports recently did a study on protein powders, and they found that some of the protein powders that are out there have an unhealthy dose or a potentially hazardous dose of lead in each serving. So you only find that out when there is some disinterested party out there, and that's why it is usually a nonprofit, um, right? When there's a disinterested party out there that's willing to do investigative work to protect consumers. So
Okay. Okay.
in
So
some
that's
cases, our
that's
government
where,
mandates some of this kind of work,
yeah.
but actually a lot of it comes from even today, a lot of this safety net that we all take for granted comes from the work of dedicated nonprofits and actual people.
Okay. So that's where you're sitting as this disinterested party, as you describe it, in the cannabis space.
Yeah.
And so you go out and you procure on the consumer side some products, look at the testing. Where where would they access the data that you're then providing to consumers? Like, how would they say, I want to check a website, or I want to look and see does this particular brand of product live up to its labeling, its expectations, how it's being, shown in the marketplace? Where do they find that information?
So they can go to www.cansci.org. I think I put it in the chat also.
Okay.
That's CANNSCI.org. All right, that's our website. In particular, I think that listeners might enjoy the tasting testing page that has a bunch of product reviews. Um, Even if you're not in Massachusetts, if you read these product reviews, I bet you will, and look at some of the videos and some of the test results that I share. Um, I think that you'll learn some really interesting things about how cannabis works, how cannabis testing works, and how to appreciate quality in cannabis. I'm pretty confident that that my reviews at least do that much. They may not be
Okay.
the best product reviews ever, but they are definitely 100% honest. And they teach you a little bit with each one.
So I know that, one of the hot sort of topics, you see it a lot on LinkedIn, you see, in conversations at trade shows and where the industry gets together. I'm sure that, we have as we're taping this, MJ BizCon is on the horizon. I'm sure there'll be people having these conversations there. But, testing results, particularly around the THC levels, is hotly debated. We see quite frequently people posting pictures of labels that claim really, really high total cannabinoid, total THC numbers. What are you seeing when you look at a label or you get a jar or a bag that has bud in it that has a really high number? And let's say that, for me, I would say anything over 28%, 30%, I'm gonna look at and be like, that seems really high. What are you
Yeah.
seeing the label versus the testing on the consumer side relative to those really high numbers we're starting to see?
Well, that is going to depend a lot on the state that you're in. Exactly how it works. So there is some texture to this state by state. Um, but yeah, that's a great point. So I guess yeah, and I have a whole lot I could say about this. I will actually start by just telling you that one of the things I like to do sometimes is hang out at an event, um, and just especially like a very like a weed event that's like very open to general public, that's not very insider industry. Um, and I like to stop people as they're coming in, and I ask them if they shop in dispensaries, and then I ask them how they choose the weed they buy. And the most common answer is they pick the high THC, especially guys. Women are way more likely to say that they pick based on the name or the look of the company or something else like that. Um, and and then I ask them how they know that all those numbers are right, and they say, "Ooh, I bet." Oh man! And then they usually like they almost look like that was enough to just prove that they're being lied to right there. Just asking the question is enough to make them doubt it. Um, it's funny, like yeah. So like that is the mentality. In Massachusetts, I see that there is some overstatement of THC levels, but in some other states, that overstatement is like way out of hand. It's totally like more. And it's also brand by brand here a little bit. So um, yeah, this is it's a pretty textured thing. Um, but I would say so with Massachusetts product, like, and it's a challenge mostly of flour. All right. So like they don't tend to. I've done tests of like say especially gummies
Yeah.
from dispensaries, and they're
Mhm.
usually labeled pretty accurately. So but the flower especially, right, I think that the THC is really valuable when you have to actually get the flower to grow it, when it's a marker of actual quality and success of your grow, right? Which it is a marker. I'm not saying it's the parameter that people should treat it as, but sure, it's a marker of maturity and quality of the flower. Um, so, like it's like if I grow weed that's only 15% THC, um, there's not a lot I can do about that at that point, right? Like, but I may have a hard time selling it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because people are
Sure.
gonna, right? So, so that I think that's why it happens with flour more than with other products. With other products, they could just add a little more THC, right? Like it wouldn't be that hard, but you can't add a little more to your weed very without adulterating it. Um, I've seen that in some places, like there's a colleague of mine who does some similar work for Canada, and he regularly posts on social media um, that say 80 more than 85% of the flour sold in the last quarter in X province of Canada
Mhm.
was labeled 30% or above THC.
Okay.
Like
And
just
yeah.
statistics like that just show you. I mean, this is, you know, I know from personal experience, at least in here and actually testing weed from other places too, has also showed me this is pretty universal. It is totally possible in one of these commercial facilities to
Mhm.
grow flower that is about 30% THCA. All right. That is possible. So then the total THC is going to come out to be around 25%, actually, if it's calculated correctly for decarboxylation. Um, so that is totally possible. but at about 30%, it starts becoming really improbable. Like even the same strain and the same mom won't like produce the same crops every time, and not every plant will either, like it just starts getting really hard to attain consistently. And above that, occasionally it'll happen in one of these commercial facilities, but it's usually not reproducible. I tested one batch in a commercial facility that they had one time that was 37% THCA, but they never reproduced. And it was terrible flower in terms of its structure. Like it just fell apart,
Mm,
you know? So like it happens every once in a while, but there's like you start seeing why it's rare, right? Like it's not health. It's actually not healthy, right? It wasn't, right? The flowers barely held together at all. They were like, there were other problems with it, right? And it was not reproducible. Like they didn't get that same performance again, no matter what they did.
yeah, yeah. I think that it's really interesting the comment that you made about sort of the informal polling of consumers and
Yeah.
asking the question of what drives you to make a purchase, and the differentiation between oftentimes male consumers who say, well, I'm just going for the highest THC values, and female consumers who have other reasons, branding, or other reasons beyond that. And I'm sure that it's not a
Yeah, and
perfect line in the
and
sand.
yeah, and I don't want to I don't want to express that as some kind of a robust research, and this is partly maybe my own bias could be perceived, like I also perceive men as being a little more susceptible to kind of like the measuring,
Yeah,
like we're
sure,
kind of
sure.
always doing it against each other
Yeah,
and keeping track. And guys are just way more likely to say, bro, it got to be over 30% or I don't feel a thing.
right. Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
And I don't
so that's a really, so that's more, it's anecdotal and descriptive, not analytical.
know, but it really does. It really, I think it tracks with a lot of other, people, producers' experiences,
It
dispensary
sounds
side
intuitively
experiences,
right.
right? It tracks, right? I think for a lot of people have had similar experiences, but it also lends itself to what you're saying about this race to, higher and higher THC percentages, and whether the plant can even express and get to those levels successfully. And certainly, we've all seen strains that will pop really high THC percentages, but they don't have good bud structure, or they have other issues. They're prone to diseases more so than
They're hard to
their
cultivate.
counterparts. They're hard to cultivate for some reason. They're not ideal. And at the same time, the question becomes, well, then is it just a matter of, um, more input, right? So one of the things that we're seeing a lot on the cultivation side is really a push for more light. And as we increase the light, as we increase the energy input to the plant, we're seeing that the plant will take that energy input, increase its other demands for essentially energy input of nutrients and water and things like that, and it will yield more. And typically, it is a push to get it to express a higher THC and cannabinoids, or cannabinoid and terpene expressions tend to improve as well. But to
Yeah.
what extent can we really push the plant to do that? Um,
Yeah,
so
these
I
are
think
like the gravy compounds for the plant. These are like the secondary metabolites that aren't involved in its, that aren't involved in its like life essential metabolism, if you know what I mean, right? And its
yeah,
fundamental structure. So, these are all the, and like and some of those rare flavor compounds that give it really real distinction. Um, are some of the graviest of them all, right? Only a really happy plant, really well expressing plant even gives them. So, you know, I agree. I mean, this absolutely like the fundamental, like chemical way of thinking about it too, right? Like that the pumping up the inputs and making the plant feel like it has an absolutely luxurious environment will all would be expected.
yeah, Right.
to
The
yield
returns are
most of
expected.
these
Yeah.
gravy kind of compounds, right? But there's going to be limitations because they're all expressed in these fragile little structures. Or I mean, that's pretty much where where they're mostly are expressed. It's not actually where they're like not 100% only expressed in those, but like they basically accumulate in these fragile little structures on the flowers, right? That are a long way from any of like the business of the plant.
Yeah,
You know?
sure. Yeah, 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 which
Um,
makes sense. I mean, and certainly has
like,
been, the experience of those, of growing it, right?
yeah.
And what one of the things I'm curious about, so, the work you're doing now, you mentioned that, your PhD and you were in a position where you were working with engineers and stuff. So it sounds like that was not in cannabis, but how did you get to where you are now, where you're focused on this effort in the cannabis industry, and where does how do we get to here?
Yeah, that's a well that story is really interesting. So I spent most of my say like academic career um going through graduate school and then a couple of postdoctoral scientist positions. Um and during all that work I was mostly studying what I would call like applied quantum mechanics. So I learned about like fundamental quantum theories, and then I would design model systems for them, which are basically molecules. Quantum mechanics happens at like mostly the submolecular scale. And so I would do, for example, a molecule is basically a particularly contoured box that holds its electrons. And so I would do different interesting, I would design molecules, I would build them, and then I would do physical experiments on them and use computational modeling to interpret the results and sort of demonstrate the the limitations and the scale of breakdown of quantum mechanical behavior of these fundamental particles.
You're it sounds like, I mean, that's some really
So
like heavy stuff, man.
I hit this point eventually where I was in Germany and I was doing really cool, sophisticated stuff, working with these physicists who have these, one of a kind instruments that can look at single molecules on ultra reactive surfaces of metals, and you make these novel quantum structures, right? Oh, it's super cool, right? You're imaging a molecule one atom at a time, like literally seeing kind of a representation of it. I just felt like I wanted to change. So I looked for a new scientist position. I went to Harvard and then I got sick from a cannabis e-cig. And I said, hey, there's no consumer protection for cannabis. That's
So
really how I got to it, man. Like,
yeah, so it sounds like, so you're at this tipping point of your career. You're evaluating, like, kind of, what am I doing with my life, which I think we all get to at some point in our careers, as like, is this really what I'm
yeah.
passionate about, and is this really what I want to do? Am I making a difference? Those kinds of questions. And then you get a cannabis e-cig. When you say a cannabis e-cig, to me, like, it was a pre-filled vape or something like that, is
Yep. Yeah. It was
along
it
those
was a
lines. Yeah.
cart. It was a cart I bought on the internet, and they delivered it to the back parking lot behind my
Okay.
building. So it was
Okay.
really convenient. And I didn't
Yeah.
have to go to the dispensary across the river.
Yeah. And
Oh.
so you smoke that, you get sick. When you say you got sick, what do you mean? You got what happened? Like,
I mean, I actually, I came closer to dying than I really like, um, uh, should have allowed, yeah, than I care to think. Because a lot like, and I learned something fundamental, which is that if you make yourself sick with your drug habit, you're really embarrassed about it sometimes, and that actually is an inhibition to seeking treatment. So
mm,
I had cartridges that were diluted with vitamin E acetate, and I got that illness, the E Valley illness.
okay.
Um,
Yeah, I remember when that happened. Yeah.
yeah, that was fall of 2019 that was big.
Yeah.
And what that illness entailed was sort of like a runaway inflammation that made my lungs stop working. And so by the time I uh, by the time I went to the emergency room, I was hypoxic enough that I was having trouble seeing. So I really cut it way too close. And if you're ever like, yeah, I don't know how to give someone advice like to not do that to yourself, but like, dude, whatever thing you did, go get some help and just tell them what you did. So, yeah.
So that experience, right? It all kind of was like a perfect storm, it sounds like, around career and what am I doing? And then this happens. And so then you say, okay, there's no baseline or there's no studies, there's no consumer protection on these things, and then that's where you move into. And so
Yeah,
how do you
yeah.
go about setting up shop with that? I know you said originally you were like in Cambridge and then you moved, but how do you go about setting up shop in this space where sounds like not a lot of there's not a lot of examples maybe, or maybe there are.
Well, I mean, I'm not the only person with some of these thoughts and ideas. And I'm not the only person who has done consumer protection work in cannabis. But yeah, it is not very well trod ground. That's for sure. For a while, I didn't know what the hell I was supposed to do. For a while, I was trying to shoehorn this into like, this is how you would do this kind of research. And it would be like an academic research group, but like it just didn't really fit that very much. And but I did learn a lot through that, and over the course of that I started working with people at cannabis testing labs, because that was one of the ways that I could get an experiment done, right? And I could trade. I say, hey, I'm this scientist from Harvard, do you want to help me out? And they say, oh yeah, sure, right? But through working with them, I actually started learning about how their industry worked, and I started learning about like like stuff like the competition, the competition for clients,
Right.
and
Yeah.
how results could be mentioned, and they would start sharing these stories. Like, gosh, I mean, like, gosh, this client called me up the other day, and he said that he'd had another lab test the same batch, and he got a higher number from them, and and he asked what we could do about it. And I don't
Yeah.
know what to do now, Jeff. Like a couple of
Yeah.
times, my friends would actually call me up with this sort of thing. Like, I don't know like, what do I even say to this guy? They would, right? So I started realizing they have this problem. I started connecting it with all that stuff I told you earlier, right? Like
Yeah.
about engineering. I said, oh, I see what problem these guys are having. Someone set up a bunch of rules, but didn't check what the results are. So in 2022, I first started founding a nonprofit, and I didn't manage to navigate the 501(c)(3) certification. I managed to kick the can down the road like a bunch of times and keep it open, but I didn't resolve everything because I was so bad at paperwork, basically.
Okay.
Um, so like and it's taken me multiple attempts to like kind of organize the right group of people to make a good board of directors, and to even understand how a person in my position is supposed to interact with that board of directors, and what all kinds of, all the things that we need to do. So, yeah, like I've been, at, I'm really shocked at how ill-equipped I started out, and thought that, and I can remember, I can also remember how overconfident I was at the beginning, and how I thought it was going to be easy. And that everyone was going to like just pitch in and help and think this is all perfect and just get it. And then I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much to explain to people. It's so hard to explain it in a way that makes sense to everybody. There's so much more to like figure out about. Everything's more complicated than I realized.
Now that you're on that track, right, and you've got this service, this consumer centric service that's in Massachusetts, is there a thought where you can expand that to other markets? Is that something that's on the horizon for you?
Um, and I test products in other states. I do collaborations with scientists in other states.
Mhm.
And recently, I've also been ordering a lot of uh, like cannabinoid products, and boy, I don't even know what to call it anymore. Sort of other, all the products that you can order online that typically are sold under the moniker hemp, but
Hemp
which are
derived,
clearly
yeah,
not
sure.
hemp. They are either synthetic cannabinoids or marijuana, in an awful lot of cases that I encountered. So those come from all over.
Sure. Yeah. Those are
I can
coming
get
from
the
all
samples
over.
easily through the mail. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, then the latest news that they slipped in on the continuing resolution that passed,
oh
they
yeah.
slipped in the ability to shut that down or regulate that. I saw a couple of posts about it online. I haven't paid a whole lot of attention to it, just because I don't, operate in that hemp side of the world. Although I do pay attention to consumer behavior on it for sure. But when you're, bringing in product that you find, you're saying you find most of it is certainly not as advertised.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look, I've been scolded sometimes for like, people complain that I paint with too broad a brush. So I'll just describe exactly my experience, which is if I search, if I do, I've done things like do a Google search for THCA hemp and or just hemp, right?
Sure.
Okay. And then I buy products from everything on the first page of results,
Hmm.
right? And every single one of them is if it's a flower product, then it is just weed,
Hmm.
right? It's marijuana. It's not hemp. And if it's a gummy, then it's always synthetic and always mislabeled for every single one that I find, right? On that first page. Okay. So, and then like if I go to the second page, I haven't checked as thoroughly yet, but I've only bought some of the ones on the second page yet, right? So like, and I've never found like, that process never got me to like a single compliant, totally wholesome product. You know what
Really?
I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, so if they're out there, they're rare or they're hard to find or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I mean, it definitely that loophole definitely opened up a whole new world, right? A brave new world where,
yeah. And I
I
don't
mean,
feel that so if there was a great, like, responsible, hardworking, like, group of hemp people, and some people claim to be, and I can't prove it. Like, I don't know who's who. Like, these guys, I interact with all these people from a distance. They all say the same thing, right? So
sure.
if they were, if there, some of these folks were nice and responsible and just being brought down by a few bad apples, like, they were having one hell of a time talking about that, honestly.
Hmm. Hmm. Sure.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. So another question I have for you. So speaking of just compliance type stuff, right? So remediation is another, you've got we
Yeah.
talked earlier about the THC, THCA and the high testing levels and the labeling and all that stuff. But then, we've also got the remediation, which is another sort of hot button, right? Where one of the interesting things that I've heard claimed, and I think if I remember correctly, this was a conversation I had like at a trade show with somebody or at a happy hour afterwards, where they were a company that sold a particular type of remediation type equipment. And the gentleman I was talking to made a statement that, well, if and when things are federally regulated and federally legalized, then they will require a kill step in the processing. And
He
I
prayed.
don't know. I don't know if that's
So he prayed right in front of you. Okay.
yeah. So, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
He was praying to the spirit there. But the
Yeah, yeah, yeah. For
is
exactly the one
right
thing
for
for
the
what
one
exactly
thing.
what he needs most to be as rich as possible. Okay.
Sure, yeah. But so what are your thoughts on remediation? And
Yeah.
I've seen over the years, a few different types of remediation equipment, right? That I think some use ozone, some use radiation. Recently I was introduced very briefly. I was doing some consulting for a company on some design and construction work where they were looking at a piece of equipment that I think was cryogenic and did almost like a flash. I think it was like a flash freezing
Huh,
process that
fascinating.
occurred. That was interesting. And so I'm just curious, what are you seeing? What's your experience with that? And particularly given your background and we were talking about looking at things on the subatomic molecular level and all that kind of stuff from a quantum standpoint, what's the effect? beyond
Yeah.
just killing mold and microbials and the things that it's meant to do, which I think they do for the most part, but what's the overall effect?
Well, the interactions of high energy radiation with molecules actually is like a subject of particular interest to me. So, yeah, I'm glad that you pointed out that way. But when it comes to remediation, I think there are like kind of a few different points to kind of that are worth bringing up, I think, to put into a little package and try to put a bow on it. So the first thing I'll address is your encounter in this trade show. All right. And I'll say, yep. Everybody who works for these companies that sell these remediation devices, they have extremely high hopes for being a mandated part of the commercialization of cannabis. All right. Um, and yeah, so one of the reasons for that is that the there's already a very large established industry, especially for, say, irradiating machines. All right.
Mhm.
They're used in different kinds of medical imaging and treatment, and various sorts of radiating machines and sterilizing machines are used in a lot of commercial agriculture and food sterilization too. So those are very stable businesses. And the kinds of machines that produce that radiation, especially, tend to last a long time. So
Okay.
such a company like that has little big companies like that, their markets become kind of static, or dynamically static, right? There is some dynamic, but it's a pretty stationary state, right?
Mhm.
After a while, and their only real prospect for growth is to move into some new business like weed, right? So
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so you can kind of understand that they're going to have a really strong motivation. They're going to have a lot of money and regulatory access out the gate because they're already a big business that's already in a lot of highly regulated spaces, right? And of
Mhm.
course, they're going to try to convince every government person and every regulator that their step is absolutely essential for consumer safety, right? And I mean that if that's true, maybe I wouldn't cry. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's exactly what we should be doing or the only way to do it. And what they propose, what these companies propose is that, oh, this is just going to be an inline kind of a prophylactic step. It's not going to have a meaningful detriment on the quality of the product. It's just going to make it safer, right? So
Sure.
if
Sure.
that were really
Yeah.
how it always played out, that would be great, right? But the problem is that when I hear how this is really used in the industry from people who were there, I hear different stories. I hear stories about flower. I heard a story, someone told me a story this past weekend at a trade show about his experience in a cultivation that he left soon after this because of it, where they had a room that got powdery mildew and they took a bunch of those buds
Mhm.
with powdery mildew on them, put them into an auto trimmer wet,
Mhm.
sprayed the room with powdery mildew, and then ran it through the remediation until it tested clean, and then they
Mhm.
sold
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
All right. I have heard from a lab operator who got submitted samples from the same batch of a cultivator again and again after progressive runs through the remediation. The flower started out in the, above the, contaminated above the scale of his test, so
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
in the many millions of colony forming units per gram in the
Yeah.
parlance of this microbial testing, right? And then you get it down to 1 million, and then 500K, and then 100K, and then finally pass. And he said he went through 4 cycles. It's the same flower. The guy sends 4 samples and then remediates it each time, trying to get it to pass.
Sure.
Right? Like is just, I mean, it's crazy. And so I know these are some of the worst stories that people can come up with to tell me, but like they illustrate like the huge potential for abuse because anything like that, right? That machine is killing things, but it is not removing all the poisons that
Mm,
those organisms excreted, all
mhm,
right, and
mhm,
that you are
mhm,
consuming, all right, and it's not eliminating their skeletons, which are also potentially allergenic, especially in large doses, right?
mhm,
And it's when and the fact that their presence there is a sign of spoilage of a produce product, this flower, right? So, and you're not fixing any of that, right? So you're really taking like the same thing as like a moldy blueberry, nuking it until it tests sterile, but it's still a moldy blueberry.
mhm.
Still soft like that. It still has its smell,
Yeah,
right? You can
yeah,
smell the fermentation,
sure.
right? And the rot.
So
Okay.
what, so what in that case, right? And those are extreme cases, I
Those are
feel like,
extreme
right?
cases,
These are
man. I'm
extreme
not saying that
cases.
that happens all the time, but it happened.
Sure.
But it happened enough for me to meet people who saw
Sure,
it.
yeah, and I guess I think anywhere you're going to find some, some outliers, right?
Yeah.
And but in the
But
case
then,
of
like,
like flour, right? So what is and what are the various remediation styles? What are they actually doing to the flour? Like, does it degrade quality? Do you see? Can you see that in the work you're doing?
those are those are hard questions. Yeah, yeah. So in my routine kind of testing, I'm gonna have a hard time telling, especially because I'm not seeing the flower like before and after,
Right,
right?
right.
So there are not many studies of before and after that are published. Um, as far as I know, by far the most deployed technology in this sort of remediation space or kill step space is radiation.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't have firm numbers on it, but I think it really is like the very large majority of the devices, and that the other methods, the other sort of mechanisms are not used that much in
Yeah,
by comparison,
yeah. Right.
relatively.
Yeah, I would agree. That's my experience is that that's the most
Yeah, right. From
widely
the
used. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So so I mostly talk about it in terms of that, just for the sake of simplicity. Um,
Yeah.
and but like whatever the mechanism, um, what I find is that the company that sells it is always capable of producing one or two charts that seem to suggest that it has a negligible impact on the overall chemical content of the flower. But
Hmm.
I've never seen any I've never seen any data presented the way that in a way that would be convincing to me that that's like any sort of a principle versus just a one-off time that like, well, sometimes you put it in and it comes out okay, right? Like
Sure, sure. Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
every once in a while you can. And also the way it's looked at has generally it's not been very detailed chemical analysis.
Hmm.
And
Sure.
it hasn't been the kind of chemical analysis that might answer all the questions I have about it. So, I definitely have some skepticism about the process, but I mean, here's what I will say. I mean, the if they use this inline kill step, then they send their flower out for testing. The test results and the compliance testing and the labeling and all that, in principle, it can be based on the result after the test, after the remediation, right? So
Mhm.
it's not like as long as it's not a bait and switch, right? And people are told in principle there could be nothing wrong with it, right?
Sure, sure. So
I mean,
what
right?
about
I mean, like the level of THC and terpenes was determined after the radiation. If it
sure,
was, then that
if
would
it
be fine,
was.
right? Who
Yeah,
cares?
yeah. So what about like, I know like I have friends who run greenhouses that, they really struggle in certain markets where the CFU levels are just super, super low.
Yeah.
And same with indoor, but I'm just thinking about, some folks in particular I've worked with in the past that they're in a market, they're in a greenhouse. I mean, I think maybe the location of the greenhouse played into this as well, but they're running outside air through this thing all the time, and you can't control what's in the outside air, nor is it necessarily harmful to anyone, or
Yeah,
nor is it necessarily harmful to the majority of persons because they're already existing within that space. So, is there something to
yeah.
be
I
said
have a
for like it being
sorry, go ahead.
unreasonable? Like the levels is there something to be said for the levels being unreasonable? And one of the things I think about too is like specific to your market in Massachusetts where you're operating. I know um when I was involved years ago with building and opening a lot of the early grows out there, they started to really impose some strictness around what pesticides could be used and what treatments could be used. And a lot of the time, one of the things that we ran into was the lettuce at the Stop and Shop wouldn't pass the testing requirements for cannabis.
Mm,
And yet it's lettuce at Stop and Shop, right? And
right.
yet, so is there something to be said for some of these numbers may be arbitrarily imposed on operators, which then forces them into some type of remediation?
Yeah, yeah. Like so much of this is like that's a great question, and it's also the answer is a little bit complicated. Um, because like I mean there are a few, like there's a there but I would say like the most certain answer I can give you is yes, nearly all of these standards have been selected totally arbitrarily. Yes. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Like people took their first look, said, "What do you think it should be?" And they just picked something and they did it. There's almost no, and I know that is true because there's no evidence there was no way to do it with an evidence-based approach because we don't have the evidence. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sure. Yeah.
you're going to have to make up something pretty much to start with because we just simply don't have all the evidence, right? And like your comparison about the lettuce is worth mentioning, but I'm also not smoking the lettuce, right? So, like so it's possible, right? Like like what's acceptable for the lettuce doesn't necessarily tell me what is acceptable for the weed, right? That's all I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not dismissing its value as a touch point. I'm just saying it's maybe not the whole answer either, right? So what do you do, right? Well, um, you know, this is some of the hardest stuff because to work on because it sounds really scary to people and nobody has a real sense of the hazards. Um, but I agree that especially like a lot of the microbial limits, they're set probably way too stringent.
Mhm.
Um, the a lot of like the pesticide testing is almost like limit of quantitation or limit of detection thresholds, and analytical chemistry is just really sensitive these days, man.
Yeah.
Like when you start looking at the parts per billion level, you find bits of everything in everything. Okay, like it's not the same, or science has not actually agreed what it means, right? And in fact, it's a fundamental challenge. It becomes a fundamental societal challenge that's outside of the scope of science, but that
Mhm.
science has a lot of work to do on, which is like answering the question. So as we keep getting better at detecting smaller and smaller amounts of everything, how do we set meaningful limits?
Mhm.
Because all of the divisions that are in our minds are all intuitive to our macroscopic world,
Yeah. Yeah.
right now,
Well,
parts per billion, right, is totally different. Like, can my body detect parts per billion of anything? Yes.
right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it
It can.
also can't detect parts per billion of an awful lot of stuff,
Right.
right?
Well,
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, it sounds like a lot of work to be done, and
yeah,
someone like
yeah.
yourself with the science background, I think coming into the space and helping push these dialogues forward is really really important.
Well, thanks.
So I
Yeah.
just I think we covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate your time today. I'm so glad to talk to you. I've learned a ton talking to you today. And
It means a lot.
before we go, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
All right. Well, you can look for me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. You can check out our website again. That is CANN dot sorry, CANNSCI.org. You can look for us on Instagram. Um, our Instagram handle is at cansci.org, all spelled out, CANNSCIDOTORG. We had to
Okay.
get creative in order to come up with a Instagram handle that they wouldn't ban. Um,
Okay.
um, so yeah, and yeah, so those are the main ways to look at to find us. Um, yeah, and I think like the main thing that like listeners can do if they if they want to help, or if they want to be a part of the solutions to the challenges and keep moving things forward um, through really all of the challenges that we face, and I mean all the way at the federal level. um, Keep being inquisitive. All right.
Mhm.
Keep being flexible. Don't assume you know everything yet. We're still learning new stuff every day about this, and we're still figuring out how to do it. Um, and stay hopeful, all right, and stay positive about it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time today, for sharing your experience with everyone listening and watching the podcast. And yeah, I thank you very much, and look forward to continuing the discussion in the near future with you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Jeff.